What have you made of this morning's developments?
Look, thank you, Tom. I think what we're looking at in the US is really the tip of the iceberg of anxiety, stress, fear. We all know that America has been dealing with the COVID crisis in a very different way than we're seeing here in Australia. They haven't dodged the health bullet, so to speak, and they haven't dodged the economy bullet as well. And so if you look at the COVID pandemic, there's now 6 million cases around the world, and almost 2 million of those are in the US. There's about 300 or more than 300,000 deaths, and over 100,000 of those deaths are in the US. And the issue with the US is the majority of deaths are occurring in both the elderly but also in the black population, in those who are sort of more vulnerable. And so in my view, some of this, Black Lives Matters outpouring of grief and anger and fear is really the bringing together of what's sort of an absolute crisis across America. So these protests and riots and looting that we're seeing is in response, obviously, to this terrible death, but it actually, I think, reflects a broader problem across America. And we're seeing chaos and crisis in America, and it just reminds me of really how lucky we are to be here in Australia, that we've dodged the health bullet. We seem to be managing well with the economy. I mean, of course, we can't take these things for granted, but we are in a different scenario here in Australia, and we look at what's happening in the US, and it's just horrific.
Matt, what are your thoughts, in particular, on Donald Trump over the past few days? A lot of tweets and address this morning.
Yeah, Tom, it's extremely alarming what's happening in the United States at the moment. I certainly don't condone violence and destruction of property, but I think Afro-Americans, Black Americans have just had enough. And they've seen that what happened with George Floyd, the sheer horror of that incident, and the fact that there's been a concerted problem with this sort of actions against Black Americans in the past, and it's boiled over. And I think that what America really needs now is some leadership, some unity and stability. And unfortunately, many Americans think that they're not getting that from this president at the moment.
So what do you think? Are Americans getting that from this president?
Well, certainly tweeting things that seem to be divisive, that seem to be to not bring people together, I don't think help. But what America, I think, needs at the moment is some leadership and stability. And I think that that's what the American people are crying out for.
Katie Allen, is that a fair synopsis from Matt Thistlethwaite?
I think the issue with America is they're coming into this very serious election cycle, and I think what we see as a very different reaction in the US versus Australia is Australia has had a bipartisan approach with Scott Morrison developing the national cabinet, and we're seeing the state and federal governments working hand in glove pretty consistently. And what we're seeing in America is a complete breakdown of that. So there's a lot of, buck passing between the federal and the state governments very early in this pandemic. There was a unwillingness by the president to acknowledge that there was a problem in the first instance, and then to say it was the states that actually should be responsible for this. So there seems to have been, in the last few weeks and months, a real breakdown in bipartisanness going forward. Now, that is in the context as we move into a pretty serious time of the election cycle. So this sort of politicisation of what really is a health and economic problem is really being played out pretty terribly in the US, in my view.
Looking at some domestic issues, at Q&A last night, Joel Fitzgibbon reiterated his view for the next election. Matt Thistlethwaite, Labor cannot have a more ambitious emissions policy than the government. Do you agree?
Well, Tom, the one thing that the coronavirus pandemic has highlighted is the importance of taking notice of the scientists and listening to the advice of scientists and medical experts. That's what's helped Australia get through this pandemic in such good condition. The approach that Labor will take in respect of climate change is listening to the advice of the scientists. And scientific community, the global community, signed up to a scenario where we want to limit global warming to 2 degrees and make sure that we have targets in Australia that are consistent with that. And that's the approach that Labor will take.
So is 26 to 28% consistent with that or not?
Well, you know, that's for the government to explain. On all of the measures that have been produced to date, Tom, where it looks like we're not going to meet the targets that we've signed up to. So I do agree with Joel.
Well, we most likely will with Kyoto, but that's the question. Should we go further than the government, which is 26 to 28% and using the Kyoto carryover? Joel Fitzgibbon says can't be more ambitious. Do you agree?
Well, in the past, Labor said that we shouldn't be using those accounting tricks, that we shouldn't be using Kyoto carryover targets. Really, it's a cop-out to try and avoid real action on climate change. And ultimately, when we're talking about action on climate change, Tom, we're talking about our kids' future. And I want to make sure that we pass on a cleaner environment, a safer environment, and one in which we're reducing emissions and ensuring that we're growing renewable energy and those economic opportunities that come from renewable energy into the future.
Do you think it's fair to say your electorate, Katie Allen, would like a more ambitious policy than the one that Coalition currently has?
Well, I've been speaking to my electorate from the very moment that I got elected last year about strong action on climate, and I'm very pleased to welcome the Roadmap Technology Discussion Paper, which is about engaging with business, the community and new technology to get us to where we need to get to. Look, I don't think anyone sensible in this country doesn't agree on the problem, which is we need to have cheap, renewable energy that's going to get us to a cleaner, greener future so that we can supply energy in a cheap way, both for our domestic market, but also to export it overseas. What we disagree about is what technologies we use. And at the moment, I think that's where the discussion is. And I think that's a mature and sensible discussion. We've been very consistent. The Coalition is about technology, not taxes.
But just on the technology roadmap, with that came as well the Minister, Angus Taylor, saying there wouldn't be any increased target to go along with that. Was that disappointing that's been ruled out already?
Well, what we've signed up to is a carbon neutral future, and that is actually signed up into the agreements that signed up to in the second half of the century. In my view, kicking the can down the road about
Australia hasn't pledged itself to be carbon neutral by 2050. Just to clarify that point.
We've pledged to carbon neutral in the second half of the century. That's what the agreement actually that we've signed up to is. The point is that we actually believe we need to understand what that looks like. We don't want to sign up to something that we can't commit to. So what we want to see is emissions reductions. That's what the community tells me they want to see. So we've got to look at the outcomes that we want to achieve. We've got to reduce emissions as quickly as possible using the technology we have available. And we've got a plan. We've actually put a budgeted carbon plan together about how we're going to meet the agreements. There's no point making these wishful thinking targets without actually having a plan to get there. And that's what I think the technology roadmap is very important about. It's about engaging with people to actually get everyone on the same page about what technology we will or will not use to get to the future, which is going to be a cleaner, greener future.